Thomas Hargrove rubbed his tired eyes as he sorted through the latest items from the estate sale. At 62, he'd been collecting antiques for over 30 years, but his passion for historical artifacts had only grown stronger with time. His small antique shop in Charlottesville, Virginia had become something of a local institution, though most of his income now came from online sales to collectors across the country. Rain pelted against the windows of his cluttered back office, creating a soothing rhythm as he carefully examined each item. The Mason estate had yielded several promising pieces: a Civil War Riorati writing desk, some silver cutlery from the 1850s, and a collection of vintage photographs that would sell quickly to the right buyer. At the bottom of the box lay a small leather-bound book, its cover worn and cracked with age. Thomas picked it up, running his fingers over the faded embossing. He recognized it immediately as a child's diary, likely from the late 19th century based on the binding style and materials. These often contained charming glimpses into daily life from a bygone era, and they typically sold well to history enthusiasts. He carefully opened the cover, mindful of the fragile binding. The first page contained a neat inscription in faded brown ink: "Property of Eleanor Mason, 1899. Below it, in the same careful handwriting, "My 10th birthday gift from father." Mason, Thomas murmured to himself. Same family name as the estate. Could be a direct ancestor. He turned to the first entry, dated January 3rd, 1899. The handwriting was remarkably neat for a child, each letter formed with careful precision. "Today father took me to town to buy new shoes. Mrs. Abernathy at the general store gave me a peppermint stick. I saw Jimmy Wilson throw a rock at old Mr. Peterson's window and run away. Mother says I must practice piano for 1 extra hour because I forgot to feed the chickens yesterday." Until November 17th, 1899, Thomas paused, rereading the last line. It seemed oddly out of place, a future date mentioned at the end of a daily entry. Perhaps it referred to some upcoming event? He turned to the next page, January 7th, 1899. "Snowed again today. Father says it's the worst winter he can remember. I helped Mother make bread and she let me knead the dough. My hands still smell like flour. Elizabeth from school has scarlet fever and everyone is worried. Father burned sage in the house to keep illness away." Until November 17th, 1899, Thomas felt a slight chill. Again, that same date at the end of the entry. He flipped through several more pages, scanning the entries. Each one ended with the same phrase, "Until November 17th, 1899. Outside, the wind picked up, driving the rain harder against the windows. Thomas reached over to turn on his desk lamp, casting a warm glow over the yellowed pages. As he continued reading, the entries described the ordinary life of a 10-year-old girl in rural Virginia school lessons. Church on Sundays, helping with chores, occasional trips to town. But as February turned to March in the diary, Thomas noticed subtle changes in Eleanor's entries. She began mentioning strange dreams, a persistent feeling of being watched, and a growing fear of the woods behind her family's farmhouse. March 12th, 1899. Heard the whispering again last night. Mother says it's just the wind in the eaves, but it knows my name. I told Father I don't want to go into the woods anymore, even to collect kindling. He seemed angry and said I was being foolish. Until November 17th, 1899, Thomas closed the diary and leaned back in his chair. A collection of goosebumps had formed on his arms. Something about the diary felt wrong, the repetition of the date, the growing unease in the child's entries. What had happened to Eleanor Mason on November 17th, 1899? His phone buzzed, breaking the spell. A text from his daughter reminding him about dinner tomorrow. Thomas glanced at the clock, nearly 11 p.m. He decided to lock up for the night, but something compelled him to slip the diary into his bag rather than leaving it in the shop. As he drove home through the rain-slicked streets, he couldn't shake the image of that neat, childish handwriting and the ominous date that ended every entry. November 17th, 1899. The next morning, Thomas arrived at his shop earlier than usual. He'd slept poorly, his dreams haunted by whispers and the image of a young girl in a white dress standing at the edge of dark woods. The diary sat on his kitchen table where he'd left it the night before, and he'd brought it back with him, determined to learn more about its author. The rain had cleared, leaving behind a crisp autumn day. Golden sunlight streamed through the shop windows as Thomas settled at his computer, coffee in hand. His first search was straightforward. Eleanor Mason, Virginia, 1899. Nothing relevant appeared, so he expanded his search to include Albemarle County records. After nearly an hour of searching through digitized archives and genealogy sites, Thomas found what he was looking for: a brief mention in the Charlottesville Daily Progress from November 1899. His heart raced as he clicked on the link to view the scanned newspaper. The headline was small, relegated to the bottom corner of the page. Local child missing, search continues. The brief article stated that 10-year-old Eleanor Mason had disappeared from her family's farm 5 miles outside of Charlottesville on November 15, 1899. Her parents, James and Margaret Mason, reported last seeing her at breakfast. The article mentioned search parties forming to comb the nearby woods. Thomas quickly searched for follow-up articles. He found one dated November 20th, 1899. Search for missing child abandoned after storm. Heavy rains had apparently hampered the search efforts, and with no sign of the girl after 5 days, authorities had reluctantly called off the official search. His hands trembling slightly, Thomas opened the diary again. He skipped ahead to entries from late October, looking for any clues about what might have happened to Eleanor. October 27, 1899. Father argued with Mr. Blackwood again about the property line. Mr. Blackwood says the old oak marks the boundary, but Father says it's the creek. Father was in a terrible mood all through supper. I try to be quiet when he's angry. The whispering in the woods was louder tonight. Sometimes I think I can almost understand what it's saying. Until November 17, 1899. Thomas continued reading, finding more mentions of the mysterious whispering, Eleanor's increasing fear of the woods, and growing tension between her father and their neighbor Blackwood. November 10, 1899. I told Mother about the figure I saw watching our house from the edge of the woods last night. She made me promise not to tell Father because it would only worry him more with all the trouble about the property. I don't want to sleep in my room anymore. It faces the woods, and sometimes I hear scratching at my window. Until November 17, 1899. The bell above the shop door jingled, startling Thomas. He looked up to see Mrs. Henderson, one of his regular customers, browsing the display of vintage teacups near the front window. He closed the diary and went to greet her, pushing thoughts of Eleanor Mason to the back of his mind for the moment. The day passed slowly, with a steady trickle of customers keeping Thomas busy. By closing time, he was eager to return to his research. Before leaving, he called his friend Robert at the County Historical Society. "A diary from 1899 belongs to a girl who went missing? That's quite a find, Tom," Robert said after hearing Thomas's explanation. The Mason family was fairly prominent back then, owned about 200 acres east of town. There was some dispute with a neighbor over the land that turned ugly, if I remember correctly. "Blackwood?" Thomas asked. "That's right. Ezekiel Blackwood. How'd you know?" "It's mentioned in the diary." "Do you know anything about what happened to Eleanor?" Robert was quiet for a moment. "The official story was that she got lost in the woods and likely died of exposure when that big storm hit. But there were rumors, accusations that Blackwood might have had something to do with it, though nothing was ever proven. And the date November 17, 1899. Does that mean anything to you?" "Not specifically," Robert replied. "But I can check our archives tomorrow if you'd like." After hanging up, Thomas locked the shop and headed home, the diary tucked safely in his bag. As he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important, some connection between Eleanor's disappearance, the disputed land, and that repeated date. At home, Thomas settled in his study with a glass of whiskey and the diary. He continued reading the entries, which grew increasingly disturbing as they approached mid-November. November 14th, 1899. "I saw him again today, the tall man at the edge of the woods. He was closer this time. I think he wanted me to follow him. His face was so dark, like it was made of shadows. Father caught me staring and asked what I was looking at, but when I pointed, there was nothing there. I'm afraid to close my eyes tonight." Until November 17th, 1899. This was the last complete entry. The next page had only a few words. November 15th, 1899. "The whispering is coming from," the sentence remained unfinished, the rest of the page blank. According to the newspaper, this was the day Eleanor disappeared. Thomas turned to the next page, expecting to find it empty. Instead, there was a single line written in a shaky, hurried hand. Very different from Eleanor's careful script. November 17th, 1899. "I know what happens today." Thomas stared at the final entry, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The handwriting was unmistakably different, more desperate, almost frantic compared to Eleanor's neat penmanship. Had she written this final entry while in some kind of danger? And what did she mean by "I know what happens today"? He flipped through the remaining pages of the diary, but they were all blank. Setting the book aside, he took a long sip of whiskey, feeling the burn in his throat. Outside his study window, the branches of an old oak tree scraped against the glass as the wind picked up. Something about the sound reminded him uncomfortably of the scratching Eleanor had mentioned at her window. Sleep evaded Thomas that night. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with questions about Eleanor Mason and her ominous diary. When he did finally drift off near dawn, his dreams were filled with whispers just beyond comprehension and glimpses of a shadowy figure at the edge of dark woods. Morning brought a text from Robert. Found something interesting about that date. Can you come by the Historical Society today? Thomas arrived at the small brick building that housed the Albemarle Historical Society just after it opened at 10 a.m. Robert, a thin man in his 70s with a passion for local history that matched Thomas's own, greeted him with a firm handshake. I spent some time in the archives this morning, Robert said, leading Thomas to a table where several folders and an old leather-bound book lay open. November 17, 1899 was indeed significant. It's when they found what they believed to be Eleanor Mason's remains. Thomas felt his heart skip. The newspaper said the search was abandoned. The official search, yes. But according to these records, James Mason, Eleanor's father, continued searching on his own. On November 17th, he found a child's shoe and what appeared to be human remains in a sinkhole on the disputed property line with Blackwood. Robert pointed to an entry in what looked like a sheriff's log. They never confirmed it was her? Not conclusively, no. This was long before DNA testing, of course. But they found scraps of clothing that matched what she was last seen wearing. The remains were incomplete. Animals had gotten to them, apparently. Thomas felt slightly ill. What happened after that? Robert's expression darkened. James Mason shot Ezekiel Blackwood 3 days later. Claimed Blackwood had murdered Eleanor over the land dispute. Mason was arrested but hanged himself in his cell before the trial. And Margaret Mason, Eleanor's mother, committed to the Western State Asylum in Staunton in December 1899. The admission records cite melancholia and delusions as the cause. Robert slid a photocopied page across the table. But here's where it gets strange. In her intake interview, she kept insisting that Eleanor wasn't dead, that she had been taken by the Whispering Man. Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. The Whispering Man? Yes. According to this, Margaret claimed there was a figure that lived in the woods who had been watching Eleanor for months. She said Eleanor had been marked somehow, chosen. Robert adjusted his glasses. The doctors, of course, attributed these stories to grief-induced psychosis. What happened to Margaret after that? She died in the asylum less than a year later. Typhoid fever, according to the records. Thomas sat back in his chair trying to process everything. And the Mason property? What happened to it? It was sold to pay James's debts. The land changed hands several times over the years. Most of it was eventually developed, though I believe some of the original wooded area still remains undisturbed. It's part of the Rivanna Trail system now. After leaving the Historical Society, Thomas drove aimlessly, his mind whirling with everything he'd learned. Eventually, he found himself heading east of Charlottesville, toward where the Mason property would have been located. Using the historical maps Robert had shown him in his phone's GPS, he managed to find what he believed was the area. He parked at a small trailhead marked with a Rivanna Trail sign. According to Robert's maps, the Mason farmhouse would have stood approximately half a mile from this spot, and the disputed boundary with Blackwood's property would have run through the woods to his right. Though the rational part of his mind told him this was foolish, Thomas felt drawn to explore the area. The trail was well maintained, but clearly not heavily used, especially on a weekday afternoon. Fallen leaves crunched beneath his feet as he walked, their bright autumn colors contrasting with the increasingly dark thoughts filling his mind. About 20 minutes into his hike, the trail dipped into a small ravine. A creek trickled along the bottom, likely the same creek mentioned in the boundary dispute between Mason and Blackwood. Thomas paused, looking around. Something about this place felt significant, though he couldn't have explained why. A gust of wind rushed through the trees, creating a sound that, if one were imaginative enough, might almost resemble whispers. Thomas shivered despite his jacket. As he turned to continue along the trail, something caught his eye, a flash of white among the browns and reds of the forest floor. Moving closer, he saw it was a small piece of paper caught against the exposed root of an ancient oak tree. He bent down to pick it up, finding it was actually a page torn from a book. The paper was surprisingly clean and new-looking. Not at all weathered as one would expect from something left outdoors. When he turned it over, his blood ran cold. Written in a familiar childish hand were the words, "He's still here. Until November 17th, 2025. Today's date." Thomas dropped the paper as if it had burned him. It fluttered to the ground, landing face up. Those words still clearly visible until November 17th, 2025. Today's date more than 125 years after Eleanor Mason's disappearance. He backed away, his heart pounding. This had to be some kind of prank, he told himself. Someone who knew he'd purchased items from the Mason estate had planted this to frighten him. But even as he thought it, he knew how unlikely that explanation was. No one else knew he had found Eleanor's diary, or that he'd come to these woods today. The rational part of his mind urged him to leave immediately, to get back to his car and drive away from this place. Instead, he found himself taking out his phone to photograph the paper where it lay on the ground. As he aimed the camera, he noticed something odd. The screen showed only leaves and dirt where the paper should have been. Thomas looked up from his phone, and sure enough, the paper was still there, exactly where it had fallen. He tried taking the photo again with the same result. The paper simply didn't appear in the image. With a trembling hand, he reached down and picked it up again, holding it tightly this time. "This isn't real," he muttered to himself. "This can't be real." Another gust of wind rushed through the trees, stronger this time, and with it came a sound that could no longer be dismissed as merely rustling leaves. It was a whisper too, indistinct to make out words, but unmistakably a human whisper. Thomas spun around, scanning the trees around him. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the ravine. "Is someone there?" Only the whispers answered, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Fighting rising panic, Thomas stuffed the paper into his pocket and began walking quickly back the way he had come. The whispers followed, growing slightly louder with each step. He increased his pace until he was nearly jogging, his breath coming in sharp gasps. When he reached a fork in the trail, Thomas hesitated. Which way had he come from? Both paths looked equally familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. He chose the right fork, moving faster now, the whispers closing in behind him. After 5 minutes of hurried walking, Thomas realized he should have reached his car by now. The trail stretched endlessly ahead, and nothing looked familiar anymore. He stopped, turning in a full circle. The forest seemed different somehow, the trees older and more gnarled, the underbrush thicker. Even the quality of the light had changed, taking on a strange golden hue that didn't match the overcast day it had been when he entered the woods. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind had died down completely, leaving the forest utterly still. "I need to get back to the car," Thomas said aloud, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. He pulled out his phone to check GPS, but there was no signal. The time displayed on the screen read 4:17 p.m. He'd been in the woods for nearly 2 hours, much longer than he'd realized. As he stood there debating what to do next, Thomas became aware of a presence behind him. He didn't hear or see anything, just felt with absolute certainty that he was no longer alone. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned around. At the edge of the trail, partially hidden by the shadow of a massive oak tree, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, dressed in what appeared to be dark, old-fashioned clothing. Its face was impossible to make out clearly, not because it was hidden, but because it seemed to shift and blur when Thomas tried to focus on it, as if it existed somehow between states of being. Thomas stood frozen, unable to run, unable even to scream. The figure didn't move or speak, just watched him with its indistinct face. Then, very slowly, it raised one arm and extended a hand toward him, not reaching, but beckoning. The spell broke. Thomas turned and ran blindly down the trail, no longer caring which direction he went as long as it was away from that figure. Branches whipped at his face and arms as he veered off the path, crashing through underbrush. The only thought in his mind was escape. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out. Finally, he stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. When he finally looked up, his last hope of rational explanation vanished. In the center of the clearing stood an old farmhouse, not a ruin or a foundation, but a complete structure that looked as if it had been built yesterday, yet with an architectural style clearly from another century. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows against the gathering dusk. With a certainty that transcended logic, Thomas knew he was looking at the Mason family home not as it had existed in his time, but as it had been in 1899. Before he could process this impossible sight, the front door of the house opened. A small figure stepped out onto the porch, a girl of about 10, wearing a white pinafore over a dark dress, her hair neatly braided. Even at this distance, Thomas recognized her immediately from the description in the diary. Eleanor Mason stood looking directly at him, her expression solemn. Then she raised her hand and pointed to something behind him. Thomas turned. The tall figure from the trail now stood at the edge of the clearing, much closer than before. It had moved without making a sound. And now, as the light faded from the sky, Thomas could finally see its face clearly, or rather, the absence of a face. Where features should have been, there was only a dark void, like a tear in the fabric of reality. The whispers returned, rising all around him, and for the first time, Thomas could understand the words, "You brought her back to us." She knew what would happen today. Thomas reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the page he had found. He pulled it out, but it was no longer the same message. Now, in Eleanor's careful handwriting, it read, "He takes one and leaves one. Until November 17th, 2025. The tall figure began to move toward him. its movements jerky and unnatural, like something not quite belonging to this world. Thomas tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. Tried to scream, but no sound emerged. On the porch, Eleanor watched impassively. As the figure reached Thomas, she finally spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I'm sorry, but now I can go home." The whispers rose to a crescendo as darkness enveloped Thomas. His last conscious thought was of the diary back in his shop, and he understood at last what the repeated phrase meant. Eleanor hadn't been counting down to her death, she had been counting down to her return, and Thomas had unwittingly helped make it happen. Detective Sarah Collins stared at the collection of photographs spread across her desk, a growing sense of unease settling in her stomach. Thomas Hargrove's disappearance had initially seemed straightforward. A 62-year-old man had gone hiking on the Rivanna Trail and never returned. Search teams had found his car at the trailhead, his wallet and phone inside. Now, 3 days later, there was still no sign of him despite extensive searches of the area. What complicated matters was the diary. When Thomas didn't show up for dinner with his daughter on November 17th, she went to check his shop and found it locked. Using her emergency key, she discovered the antique diary sitting open on his desk, along with printouts of old newspaper articles about a missing girl named Eleanor Mason and notes about a property dispute from 1899. "So he was researching this old disappearance before he went missing himself," Sarah murmured, examining a photocopy of the diary's final entry, November 17th, 1899. "I know what happens today," her partner, Detective Mike Reynolds, leaned against the doorframe of her office, coffee cup in hand. "You really think there's a connection? Guy reads about a kid who went missing over a century ago, gets spooked, goes for a hike in the same woods, and what, history repeats itself?" Sarah ran a hand through her short brown hair. "I know how it sounds, Mike, but the timing is too coincidental. Hargrove disappears exactly 126 years to the day after Eleanor Mason allegedly died, and according to his daughter, he was perfectly healthy. No signs of dementia or mental health issues." "Maybe he staged it," Reynolds suggested. "Got fascinated by this old story and decided to recreate it somehow. People do stranger things. His car was left behind. His wallet, phone, credit cards all untouched. Where would he go? How would he survive?" Sarah shook her head. "No, something happened to him out there," Reynolds sighed. "The search team is going out again tomorrow, but they've already covered that area pretty thoroughly. If he's in those woods, they would have found him by now." After Reynolds left, Sarah turned back to the diary. She had read through all of Eleanor Mason's entries, finding them disturbing in their increasing paranoia about whispers and a watching figure in the woods. Had Thomas Hargrove simply become obsessed with the story, perhaps suffering some kind of psychotic break that led him to wander off the trail? On impulse, she reached for her phone and called the County Historical Society. She wasn't surprised when a man named Robert answered. Thomas's daughter had mentioned he was a friend who had helped with the research. "Yes, Thomas was here on the 17th, Robert confirmed after Sarah identified herself. "He was very interested in the Mason case, particularly the boundary dispute and what happened after they found the girl's remains." "And did he say where he was going after he left you?" "Not specifically, but he was asking about the location of the original Mason property. I showed him some historical maps. I got the impression he might visit the area." Sarah thanked him and hung up. On her computer, she pulled up a map of the current Rivanna Trail system, overlaying it with the historical property boundaries Robert had described. Thomas's car had indeed been found at the trailhead closest to where the Mason farmhouse would have stood in 1899. As the day waned, Sarah decided to visit the site herself. The November afternoon was already growing dark as she parked beside the now familiar trail marker. Yellow police tape still cordoned off the area where Thomas's car had been found. Sarah ducked under the tape and started down the trail, flashlight in hand. The search teams had been thorough, but sometimes a fresh perspective could spot something others had missed. The fallen leaves crunched beneath her boots as she walked, creating the only sound in the otherwise silent woods. About 20 minutes in, she reached the small ravine with the creek that Robert had mentioned as the disputed boundary line. She paused, shining her flashlight slowly across the area. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just trees, fallen leaves, exposed roots. As she turned to continue down the trail, Sarah's light caught something white at the base of a large oak tree. Moving closer, she saw it was a small piece of paper caught against a root, impossibly clean and new-looking against the forest floor. With gloved hands, she carefully picked it up and turned it over. Written in a childish hand were the words, "He takes one and leaves one. Until November 17th, 2026. A chill ran through Sarah that had nothing to do with the November air. Next year's date. She quickly photographed the paper where she'd found it, then placed it in an evidence bag. As she straightened up, a gust of wind rushed through the trees, creating a sound that just for a moment sounded almost like whispers. Sarah turned quickly, scanning the darkening woods with her flashlight. "Hello? Is someone there?" Only silence answered her. Yet as she stood there, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Back in her car, Sarah examined the paper again under the dome light. The handwriting matched the photo she had of Eleanor Mason's diary, the same neat, childish script. But that was impossible. This paper was new, the ink fresh. She started the engine, suddenly eager to be away from this place. In her rearview mirror, the woods seemed darker than they should be, the shadows deeper and more solid than natural. For just an instant, she thought she saw movement at the edge of the trees, a tall, thin figure standing unnaturally still. Sarah blinked and it was gone. Just a trick of light and shadow, she told herself as she pulled away from the trailhead. Just her imagination, fueled by an old diary and a mysterious disappearance. But as she drove back toward town, Sarah couldn't shake the words written on that impossible piece of paper. He takes one and leaves one. Until November 17th, 2026, exactly 1 year from today. The Mason house stood empty at the end of Willow Creek Road, its Victorian architecture stark against the winter sky. No one had lived there since the previous owners fled suddenly 6 months ago, leaving behind most of their possessions. Local rumors claimed they'd experienced something so terrifying they couldn't even stay one more night. Dr. Elias Mercer pulled his car into the gravel driveway, surveying the property with a critical eye. As a paranormal researcher with 20 years of experience investigating allegedly haunted locations, he had heard all the stories about the cursed house, how no family had managed to stay longer than a year, since it was rebuilt in 1978 on the foundation of the original Mason farmhouse. Now, exactly 1 year after Thomas Hargrove's disappearance, Elias had received permission from the bank that currently owned the property to conduct a formal investigation. With him was Detective Sarah Collins, whose obsession with the Hargrove case had only intensified over the past year. "It doesn't look particularly sinister," Sarah commented as they got out of the car. Her breath formed clouds in the cold November air. Elias smiled thinly. "They rarely do in daylight." They unloaded equipment from the trunk cameras with infrared capability, digital audio recorders, EMF detectors, and other specialized tools of paranormal investigation. Though Sarah had initially been skeptical of Elias's methods, her encounter in the woods last November had left her more open-minded about possibilities beyond conventional explanation. The house key from the realtor turned smoothly in the lock, and they stepped into a dusty foyer. Despite being abandoned, the interior was in reasonable conditions. Some furniture remained, covered with white sheets that gave the rooms a ghostly appearance, according to the Historical Society. "This house was built on the exact location of the original Mason farmhouse," Elias said, setting down his equipment case. "The foundation is the same, and some of the structural timbers were salvaged from the original building, which burned down in the 1940s. Sarah nodded, already familiar with this information from her own research. "And the disappearances?" 7 in total since 1899, all on November 17th, all occurring in either the house or the woods behind it. Thomas Hargrove was the most recent. Elias began setting up a camera in the corner of the living room. "What's most interesting is the pattern. They happen at irregular intervals, but always on the same date, and each time someone else reappears," Sarah added quietly. This was the detail that had haunted her for the past year, the fact that on the morning after Thomas vanished, the search team had found a confused young girl wandering the trail, dressed in what appeared to be antique clothing. The girl had no identification, no memory of how she got there, and no matching reports of missing children. DNA testing had eventually provided the impossible answer. The girl was a perfect genetic match for bone fragments preserved from what had been presumed to be Eleanor Mason's remains. The child, now in foster care under a different name, was physiologically and psychologically 10 years old, exactly as Eleanor had been when she disappeared in 1899. The scientific community had no explanation. Religious groups called it a miracle. Conspiracy theorists had a field day. For Sarah, it was the beginning of an obsession that eventually led her to request indefinite leave from the police force to investigate full-time. They worked methodically through the afternoon, setting up equipment in each room of the house. As daylight began to fade, Elias suggested they focus on the master bedroom and the small room adjacent to it that had once been a nursery. The last family reported the most activity in these rooms, he explained as they mounted cameras in opposite corners of the master bedroom. The mother claimed she would wake up feeling like someone was sitting on her chest, unable to move or breathe. The father heard whispering coming from inside the walls. "And the children?" Sarah asked. The youngest, a girl of 9, claimed she had conversations with another little girl who told her about life in the olden days. After they fled, they told the realtor their daughter had started ending her diary entries with the same date, November 17th, 2025. Today. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the house's poor heating. "You didn't mention that before." Elias shrugged. "I wanted to see your reaction. You're not as skeptical as you pretend to be, Detective Collins." As night fell completely, they finished their setup and established a base in the dining room where monitors displayed feeds from cameras throughout the house. Outside, the wind had picked up, creating eerie moaning sounds as it passed through gaps in the old windows. "Now we wait," Elias said, checking the battery levels on their equipment. "If the pattern holds, something should happen tonight." The hours passed slowly. They conducted periodic sweeps of the house, taking readings and recordings, but found nothing out of the ordinary. By midnight, Sarah was beginning to think they were wasting their time. "Maybe the whole thing is just coincidence," she said, stifling a yawn. "A series of unrelated incidents that seemed connected because of the date." Elias didn't respond immediately. He was staring intently at one of the monitors, which showed the empty nursery. "Did you see that?" he asked finally. Sarah moved to look over his shoulder. "See what?" There was a shadow just for a second, like someone walking past the doorway. He rewound the footage, but nothing appeared on the playback. Before Sarah could respond, a loud thump came from upstairs, as if something heavy had fallen. They exchanged glances, then grabbed flashlights and headed for the stairs. The upstairs hallway was darker than it should have been, the shadows deeper and more solid. Their flashlight beams seemed dimmer, barely penetrating the darkness. As they approached the nursery, the temperature dropped noticeably, their breath now clearly visible in the cold air. The nursery door stood slightly ajar, though Sarah was certain they had closed it earlier. Elias pushed it open slowly, revealing the small room with its peeling wallpaper and empty crib. The previous owners had left it behind. Unwilling to take anything from this room, nothing seemed disturbed. Sarah swept her flashlight around the space, the beam catching dust motes floating in the air. "I don't see anything that could have made that sound." As she turned to leave, her light passed over the small desk in the corner and froze. There was something on the desk that hadn't been there before, a small leather-bound book, its cover worn and cracked with age. "The diary," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hargrove's diary." Elias moved forward cautiously. "That's impossible. It was logged into evidence after his disappearance." Sarah knew he was right. She had personally insured. The diary was secured in the evidence lockup, yet here it was, sitting on a child's desk in the abandoned Mason house. With gloved hands, Elias carefully opened the cover. The familiar inscription was there, "Property of Eleanor Mason, 1899. But as they turned to the final pages, they found new entries that hadn't existed before, written in Thomas Hargrove's distinctive handwriting. November 18th, 2024. "I don't understand where I am. The house looks like the Mason home, but everything is wrong. The furniture, the people, they can't see or hear me most of the time. It's like I'm a ghost in my own world. The only one who notices me is the tall man. He stands in the corner of every room watching." Until November 17th, 2025. Sarah's hands trembled as Elias turned to the next page. June 3rd, 2025. "Time moves differently here. Sometimes days pass in minutes, other times a single hour stretches for what feels like weeks. I've learned that others came before me, 7 souls taken since Eleanor, one every few decades. We're trapped in this house, in this space between worlds. Eleanor found a way out. She said we all can, but only on the right day." Until November 17th, 2025. The next entry was dated just 1 week ago. November 10th, 2025. "The tall man speaks to me now. He says he's been here since before the land had a name, before the first settlers came. He needs us to maintain his connection to both worlds. One comes, one goes, that's the pattern. Tonight I finally understood. Eleanor didn't escape this place. She traded places with me, and now someone must take my place if I'm to go free." Until November 17th, 2025. The final entry, dated today, contained just one line: "He's chosen the next one." As Sarah read these words aloud, the temperature in the room plummeted. The flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. Then came the whispers, faint at first, but growing louder until they seemed to come from every direction at once. "Do you hear that?" Elias whispered, his voice tight with fear. Before Sarah could answer, a dim, unnatural light began to fill the room, not coming from any visible source, but seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. In that eerie illumination, they could see their breath forming clouds that hung motionless in the air. "We need to leave," Sarah said, backing toward the door. "Now." But when she turned, the doorway was no longer there, just an unbroken expanse of wall covered in faded floral wallpaper. Elias rushed to where the door had been, running his hands desperately over the solid surface. "This isn't possible," he muttered, his scientific skepticism finally crumbling in the face of the inexplicable. The whispers crescendoed, and within them Sarah could now distinguish words. One comes, one goes. The cycle continues. The light grew stronger, taking on a sickly greenish hue, and in the corner of the room where shadows gathered thickest, a figure began to take shape, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs too long for any human proportion. Where its face should have been, there was only darkness, a void that seemed to swallow the light around it. The whispering man, Sarah breathed, remembering Margaret Mason's testimony from the asylum records. Elias had backed against the wall, his face contorted in terror. "What is that thing?" The figure began to move toward them with an unnatural, jerky gait, as if it existed slightly out of sync with reality. As it advanced, Sarah noticed something else, other figures emerging from the shadows around the room. Transparent, ghost-like shapes of men and women in clothing from different eras, their faces bearing identical expressions of resigned despair. One of these spectral figures separated from the others, moving to stand before Sarah, with a jolt of recognition. She realized she was looking at Thomas Hargrove older, his face gaunt and lined with suffering, but unmistakably him. "I'm sorry," the apparition said, his voice sounding distant and hollow. "He's made his choice. One comes, one goes." With horrifying clarity, Sarah understood. For Eleanor to return last year, Thomas had been taken. And now, for Thomas to be freed. She spun toward Elias, but it was too late. The tall figure had reached him, its elongated arms extending to grasp him by the shoulders. Elias's scream was abruptly cut short as both he and the entity seemed to blur, their outlines becoming indistinct before they vanished completely, leaving nothing but empty air. In the sudden silence, Sarah stood frozen, unable to comprehend what she had just witnessed. Then, slowly, the ghostly image of Thomas Hargrove began to solidify, becoming more substantial with each passing second. The other spectral figures faded away, and the unearthly light dimmed. When the transformation was complete, Thomas Hargrove stood before her, no longer a ghost, but solid flesh and blood, looking exactly as he had on the day of his disappearance a year ago, not a day older. He staggered slightly, looking around in confusion before his gaze settled on Sarah. "Detective Collins," he said uncertainly. How long has it been?" Before she could answer, the room shimmered around them. The missing door reappeared, and beyond it, Sarah could see the upstairs hallway of the Mason house, now dimly lit by emergency lights from their equipment. "1 year," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been gone exactly 1 year." Understanding dawned on Thomas's face, followed by horror as he looked at the empty space where Elias had stood moments before. "Oh God, it took him instead. What happened to you?" Sarah asked, still trying to process the impossible events she had witnessed. "Where were you?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "I was here in this house, but not in our world. It's like a shadow version of reality where that ... thing keeps its collection." He shuddered. "It's been here for centuries, Detective. It was here before the Masons, before anyone. It needs human anchors to maintain its connection to our world. And Elias? Where is he now, where I was? In the in-between." Thomas's expression was haunted. "He'll stay there until next year, when the boundary between worlds thins again on November 17th. Then someone else will take his place, and the cycle will continue." As if responding to his words, a gust of wind rattled the windows of the old house. For just a moment it sounded like distant laughter. Sarah led Thomas downstairs, both of them eager to be away from the nursery. As they reached the foyer, she noticed something on the floor that hadn't been there before, a small piece of paper. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. Written in Elias's handwriting were the words, "He takes one and leaves one." Until November 17th, 2026. Spring had come to Charlottesville, bringing with it blooming dogwoods and the sweet scent of magnolias. For most residents, life continued normally, untouched by the strange events of the previous November. Few people remembered the brief news stories about Thomas Hargrove's unexpected return, or the equally mysterious disappearance of Dr. Elias Mercer on the same night. Those who did chalked it up to coincidence, or at most, some elaborate hoax. Sarah Collins knew better. She sat across from Thomas in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe, watching as he absently stirred his untouched coffee. In the 6 months since his return, he had recovered physically but remained psychologically scarred by his year in what he called the shadow house. He rarely left his home these days, and never after dark. "I found something," Sarah said, keeping her voice low despite the cafe's ambient noise. She slid a folder across the table. "Property records for the land where the Mason house stands." Thomas hesitated before opening it. "Why are we still doing this, Sarah?" We can't stop what's happening. We can't save Elias. Maybe not, she admitted, but we might be able to end the cycle completely. This caught his attention. He opened the folder and began scanning the documents inside deed transfers dating back to the early 1800s. Survey maps, property disputes filed in county courts. The land didn't originally belong to the Masons, Sarah explained. Before 1820, it was part of a larger tract owned by a man named Nathaniel Blackwood. Blackwood, Thomas murmured. The neighbor Eleanor's father had the boundary dispute with. Sarah nodded. Ezekiel was Nathaniel's grandson. The Masons purchased their portion of the land in 1823, but there was always contention over the exact boundary line. What's interesting is what happened before the Blackwoods owned it. She pointed to a faded document, a land grant from 1795. This area was previously Innuit territory. The first colonial government survey noted something unusual about this particular plot. The local indigenous tribes, the Monacan, refused to set foot on it. They called it the Whispering Place and claimed it belonged to something that was neither human nor spirit. Thomas's face had gone pale. It was there all along. Before any of them. I think so. And I think the land disputes, the violence between the Masons and Blackwoods, it was all influenced by this entity. It feeds on conflict and suffering. Sarah leaned forward. The Monica had rituals to contain entities like this. They would create boundaries using specific materials and ceremonies to keep malevolent spirits from affecting the physical world. And you think those boundaries were disrupted when the colonists took the land? Exactly. The original survey notes mention the removal of savage stone arrangements from the property line, likely the protective barriers the Monacan had maintained for generations. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. Finally he asked, "Have you spoken with any Monacan descendants? Do they still know these rituals?" "I've made contact with a cultural historian from the tribe. She's cautious but willing to meet with us." Sarah paused. "There's something else. The pattern of disappearances, it's accelerating. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, they happened roughly 20 years apart. Since the 1950s, the intervals have been shortening. Now it's down to just 1 year. It's getting stronger," Thomas whispered, "taking more anchors to maintain its hold on our world, which means we don't have much time." Sarah closed the folder. "The historian, Dr. Leah Riverstone, can meet us tomorrow at the university. She's bringing some historical records that might help us understand what we're dealing with." Thomas seemed to withdraw into himself. "I can't go back there, Sarah. Not to those woods, not to that house. No one's asking you to," she assured him. "But we need your knowledge, your experience. You're the only person who spent significant time in the entity's domain and returned." "Except Eleanor," Thomas pointed out. Sarah had considered this. The girl they found, she has no memory of what happened to her, or at least that's what she claims. Her foster parents have refused all requests for interviews. And I can't exactly get a court order based on a supernatural investigation. What about the diary? The original diary? Still in evidence lockup. I've been making copies of the entries, looking for any clues we might have missed." Sarah hesitated. "There's one thing that's been bothering me. If this entity has been taking people every few decades since 1899, where are all the others? We only saw Elias and 6 other spirits in the nursery that night." Thomas's expression darkened. "They don't all survive, Sarah. The entity it consumes them eventually. Their energy, their essence, whatever you want to call it. They fade away until there's nothing left." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I was beginning to fade when you found me. Another few months, and there wouldn't have been enough of Thomas Hargrove left to come back." The implications of this statement hung heavily between them. If they were going to save Elias, they had less time than they thought. The next day they met Dr. Lee Riverstone in her office at the University of Virginia. A woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, she greeted them with cautious formality. "Detective Collins explained your situation," she said, gesturing for them to sit. "I must admit I was skeptical until she showed me the diary and the historical records. The similarities to our oral traditions are striking. Then you know what we're dealing with?" Thomas asked. Dr. Riverstone's expression was grave. "We call it Manhus. Not a being that exists at the boundary between worlds. According to our stories, it was trapped here long ago when the space between realms was more permeable. It cannot return to its own dimension, nor can it fully exist in ours without human anchors, people who act as bridges between worlds." "Eleanor's diary," Sarah said. "She wrote about being watched, about whispers. The entity was selecting her. It chooses carefully," Dr. Riverstone confirmed. "Usually children whose spirits are more flexible, or adults who are particularly sensitive to the unseen world. Collectors, historians, those who value the past, they're especially vulnerable." Like me, Thomas murmured. The Monacon maintained barriers around its territory for centuries, containing its influence. When European settlers arrived, they dismantled these protections, unknowingly releasing the entity to extend its influence once more. Dr. Riverstone opened an old leather-bound book on her desk. Our ancestors recorded their encounters and the methods they used to contain it. The pages were filled with faded illustrations and text in a language none of them recognized. Dr. Riverstone translated as she turned the pages, describing rituals involving specific stones placed at cardinal points, symbols carved into trees, and ceremonies performed at precise astronomical alignments. The most important element was timing, she explained. The entity's power fluctuates with certain celestial events. It's strongest on the anniversary of when it first became trapped in our world, what you know as November 17th. That's when the boundary between realms is thinnest, allowing it to take new anchors and release others. So we have 6 months, Sarah said, counting forward from April to November. 6 months to prepare and perform this containment ritual, Doctor. Riverstone shook her head slowly. It's not that simple. The original ritual required 12 tribal elders who had trained their entire lives in spiritual practices we've largely lost. I can provide guidance based on our historical records, but much of the specific knowledge has been destroyed through centuries of colonization and forced assimilation. Thomas leaned forward. But there must be something we can do. The entity is getting stronger. The time between disappearances is shortening. If we don't stop it now, how many more people will it take? Dr. Riverstone considered this for a long moment. There may be one possibility, she said finally. Not to contain it as my ancestors did, but to sever its connection to this world completely. How? Sarah asked. By removing all its anchors simultaneously. Without human bridges connecting it to our world, it would be forced back to its own dimension. She turned to a different page in the book, showing an illustration of a circular arrangement of stones surrounding a central fire. This ritual was used in extreme cases when an entity had become too powerful to merely contain. But it requires someone to enter the entity's domain willingly and guide all the trapped souls out at the moment of severance. A rescue mission to the Shadow Realm, Thomas said softly. Yes. And it would have to be performed on November 17th, when the boundary's thinnest. The person who enters would need to have been there before someone the entity has already marked. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances, both understanding the implication. Thomas would have to return to the place that had nearly destroyed him. If I do this, he said slowly, what are my chances of coming back? Dr. Riverstone's expression was solemn. I cannot promise your safe return. The ritual would sever all connections between our world and the entity's domain. Anyone still there when the connection breaks would be trapped permanently. Then we need to make sure everyone gets out in time, Sarah said firmly, including you, Thomas. As they left the university, a gentle spring rain began to fall, beating on the dogwood blossoms and creating a misty halo around the streetlights. Thomas walked silently beside Sarah, lost in thought. You don't have to do this, she said eventually. We could try to find another way. There is no other way. His voice was quiet but resolute. I've seen what that thing does to people, Sarah, how it slowly consumes them until there's nothing left. Elias has already been there for 6 months. Quote the others, even longer. If there's even a chance I can save them, I have to try. Sarah nodded, understanding his decision, even as she feared its consequences. Then we have 6 months to prepare, to learn everything we can about the ritual, the entity, and how to get everyone out safely. As they reached her car, Thomas looked up at the cloudy sky, raindrops falling on his face. You know what the worst part was in that place? Not the cold or the darkness or even the entity watching us. It was the feeling that I'd been forgotten, that the world had moved on without me, that no one was looking for me anymore. I never stopped looking, Sarah said quietly, and I won't stop this time either. Whatever happens on November 17th, I'll be there. I promise. Thomas managed a small smile, the first she'd seen from him in months. Then we'd better get started. We have a lot to learn before I go back to the Whispering Place. Summer faded into autumn, the Virginia forests transforming into a tapestry of reds and golds. For most residents of Charlottesville, it was simply the natural rhythm of the seasons. But for Sarah and Thomas, each falling leaf marked the countdown to November 17th. They had spent the intervening months immersed in preparation. Dr. Riverstone had provided translations of all the relevant Monacon texts, and Sarah had converted her apartment's spare bedroom into what looked like the office of a conspiracy theorist, halls covered with maps, timelines, ritual diagrams, and photographs of all 7 known victims taken by the entity since Eleanor Mason in 1899. Thomas had moved temporarily into Sarah's guest room after experiencing increasingly disturbing phenomena at his own home. Whispers in the walls, shadows that moved independently of any light source, and once the discovery of a child's handprint pressed into the condensation on his bathroom mirror. "It knows what we're planning," he told Sarah the night he arrived with a hastily packed suitcase. "It's trying to get to me before November." Now, just 3 days before the ritual was to take place, they sat at Sarah's kitchen table with Dr. Riverstone going over the final preparations. "The stone circle has been completed," Dr. Riverstone said, pointing to photographs of the arrangement they'd created in the woods behind the Mason house. Obsidian for grounding, quartz for amplification, turquoise for protection, and red jasper for safe passage between worlds. "The symbols have been carved as directed." Sarah nodded. "I've spoken with the current bank owner of the property. They think we're conducting an archaeological survey, so we have permission to be on the land for the next week." "What about the house itself?" Thomas asked, his voice tight. Since his return, he'd refused to set foot on the property, participating in the preparations only from a distance. "We've prepared the nursery according to the texts," Dr. Riverstone replied. "The sigils are drawn on the walls, floor, and ceiling in the traditional ochre. The circle of salt and herbs is ready. All that remains is the final component of the ritual." She placed a small wooden box on the table and opened it carefully. Inside lay a necklace, a simple leather cord threaded through a pendant made of polished black stone with flecks of gold running through it. "Tektite," she explained. "A stone formed when meteorites strike the earth. It exists simultaneously in our world and beyond it. The wearer will be able to move between realms at the moment when the boundary is thinnest." Thomas reached out hesitantly, his fingers hovering above the pendant without touching it. "And this will allow me to find the others and lead them back. It will help you perceive the paths between worlds. But you must understand the entity will know what you're doing. It will try to stop you, to confuse you, to trap you there permanently, Doctor." Riverstone's expression was grave. "Once the ritual begins, you'll have exactly 17 minutes to find everyone and return through the gateway. After that, the connection will be severed completely." 17 minutes doesn't seem like much time," Sarah commented. "It's symbolic, 1 minute for each day of the month. It's also the maximum duration we can maintain the gateway safely. Any longer and we risk the entity finding a way through into our world completely." Thomas finally picked up the necklace, the pendant swinging gently from his fingers. "What exactly will I experience when I go through?" Dr. Riverstone hesitated. "I can only tell you what our texts describe. You'll enter a place that resembles our world but is fundamentally different, a shadow realm where the entity has full control. Physical laws as we understand them may not apply. Time, space, gravity, all can be manipulated by the entity's will. And the others, Elias and the previous victims, where will I find them? They'll be drawn to the energy of the ritual. The pendant will help you see them even if the entity tries to hide them from you." She closed the wooden box. "You should rest now. Conserve your strength for what lies ahead." After Dr. Riverstone left, Sarah found Thomas standing at the window, staring out at the darkening sky. The pendant hung around his neck, the black stone resting against his chest. "You can still change your mind," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. He shook his head. "No, I can't. Not really." His fingers touched the pendant absently. "I keep thinking about what you found in the Historical Society archives. All those missing persons reports over the decades. People who vanished near those woods. How many of them ended up in that place? How many were consumed by that thing because no one knew how to fight it?" Sarah had wondered the same thing. Their research had uncovered dozens of disappearances in the area dating back to the early 1800s, many of them bearing striking similarities to the 7 confirmed cases they had identified. The true extent of the entity's predation might never be known. "I spoke with my former partner at the department today," she said, changing the subject. "Mike's agreed to be our emergency contact. If something goes wrong during the ritual, he'll come with backup." Thomas smiled faintly. "And what exactly did you tell him we'd be doing in an abandoned house in the middle of the night?" "That we're setting a trap for whoever was responsible for last year's disappearances," she replied. "It's not entirely untrue." The next 2 days passed in a blur of final preparations. They checked and rechecked the ritual components, memorized the necessary invocations, and went over the timeline repeatedly. Dr. Riverstone brought additional herbs and sacred objects, explaining the significance of each one. On the morning of November 17th, Sarah woke to find Thomas already in the kitchen, staring into a cup of untouched coffee. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, though the dark circles under his eyes gave her the answer. "A little," he lied. "Kept having the same dream. I'm back in the shadow house, but all the rooms are empty. I'm calling for Elias for the others, but there's no one there. Just the whispering in the walls." Sarah squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. That's not going to happen. We've prepared for this. You'll find them. Thomas nodded, though he didn't look convinced. Sarah, I need you to promise me something. If I don't make it back by the deadline, if I'm still in there when the 17 minutes are up close to the gateway, don't wait for me. Don't try to reopen it. Sever the connection completely. Thomas, promise me, he insisted, his eyes intense. The entity cannot be allowed to escape. If it senses weakness, hesitation, it will exploit that. Better one person remains trapped than that thing gets loose in our world. After a long moment, Sarah nodded reluctantly. I promise. But it won't come to that. You're coming back, all of you. Dr. Riverstone arrived in the early afternoon with the final components for the ritual. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they drove in tense silence to the Mason property, parking some distance from the house to avoid attracting attention. The old Victorian looked particularly foreboding in the fading light, its windows like empty eyes watching their approach. Yellow police tape from previous investigations still hung limply from one corner of the porch, fluttering slightly in the autumn breeze. Inside, the house was exactly as they had left it during their preparations. The living room cleared of furniture, the walls marked with protective symbols, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. The nursery upstairs had been transformed completely, its faded wallpaper now barely visible beneath the intricate sigils drawn in red ochre. As darkness fell outside, Dr. Riverstone began lighting candles positioned at specific points throughout the house, chanting softly in the Monacan language as she did so. Sarah checked her watch, 7:30 p.m. According to their research, the boundary between worlds would be thinnest at exactly 9:17 p.m., the moment when Eleanor Mason's remains had been discovered 126 years earlier. Thomas stood in the center of the nursery, his face pale but determined. The tektite pendant gleamed dully in the candlelight as Dr. Riverstone tied small pouches of herbs and bone fragments to his wrists and ankles. These will help guide your way back, she explained. No matter what you see or hear, keep moving toward the light of the gateway. The entity will try to confuse you, to make you lose your way. Sarah positioned herself at the doorway of the nursery exactly as they had planned. She would maintain the salt circle while Dr. Riverstone performed the chanting necessary to keep the gateway open. In her pocket was the folded paper containing the names of all 7 known victims, which Thomas would use to call them to the gateway. Time seemed to slow as they completed the final preparations. The air in the house grew noticeably colder, their breath beginning to form visible clouds. The candles flickered despite the absence of any draft, casting dancing shadows on the symbol-covered walls. At precisely 9 p.m., Dr. Riverstone began the ritual, her voice rising and falling in the ancient language of her ancestors. The symbols on the walls appeared to pulse with an inner light, and the temperature dropped further, becoming almost unbearable. Thomas stood perfectly still in the center of the salt circle, the pendant clutched in his right hand. His eyes were closed, his lips moving silently as he repeated the words they had practiced, the invocation that would open his perception to the shadow realm. The first visible sign of the ritual's effect appeared, a slight distortion in the air around Thomas, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The distortion grew, expanding outward until it formed a shimmering oval approximately 6 feet tall. 2 minutes, Sarah said, her voice tight with tension. The shimmering intensified, and within it vague shapes began to appear, the outlines of the same room they stood in, but somehow wrong, twisted, as if seen through warped glass. The whispers that Thomas had described began to fill the air, growing from barely audible to a disconcerting chorus of overlapping voices. At exactly 9:17, Dr. Riverstone's chant reached its crescendo. The shimmering oval solidified into what looked like a tear in the fabric of reality, through which they could see a distorted version of the nursery, darker, older, with shadows that moved independently of any visible source. Thomas opened his eyes, staring directly into the gateway. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, passing through the shimmering portal and vanishing from their sight. Sarah started the timer on her watch. 17 minutes until they had to close the gateway, with or without Thomas and the others. Now, Dr. Riverstone said grimly, "We wait." Thomas stepped through the gateway and immediately felt the suffocating weight of the shadow realm pressing in on him. The air was thick, resistant, as if he were moving through water rather than atmosphere. Colors here were muted, drained of vibrancy, and sounds had a hollow, distant quality. The nursery looked as it had during his year of captivity, aged and decaying, yet somehow pristine. Frozen in a moment from 1899, the tektite pendant burned cold against his skin, pulsing with an energy he could feel rather than see. According to Dr. Riverstone, it would help him perceive the paths between worlds and resist the entity's attempts to confuse or mislead him. He pulled the list of names from his pocket, the paper feeling unnaturally heavy in this realm. Elias Mercer, 2024, David Corbin, 2016. Maria Vasquez, 2003, Jonathan Fleming, 1986, Catherine Abbott, 1965, Robert Whitaker, 1940. Samuel Green, 1997, souls taken over more than a century, 7 anchors keeping the entity connected to the physical world. Thomas had to find them all and lead them back through the gateway before the 17 minutes expired. Elias, he called out, his voice strangely muffled in the dense air. Elias Mercer. There was no immediate response, but the whispering that perpetually filled this place seemed to react to his voice, growing momentarily louder before subsiding again. Thomas moved to the doorway of the nursery, looking out into the shadowy hallway beyond. The house in this realm was a twisted reflection of its physical counterpart, rooms connected in impossible ways. Staircases that led to nowhere, doors that opened into walls or bottomless pits. Thomas had learned its bizarre geography during his year of captivity, but the layout seemed to have shifted again, reconfigured by the entity's will. He closed his eyes, clutching the pendant. "Show me the way," he whispered. When he opened his eyes again, faint luminescent trails were visible in the air, wispy paths of light leading in different directions. Following Dr. Riverstone's instructions, he chose the brightest path and began to follow it through the distorted house. The trail led him down a corridor that stretched and contracted as he walked, the walls rippling like cloth in a breeze. Portraits hung on these walls, not the Mason family, but faces Thomas recognized from his research, the 7 victims, their expressions frozen in a mixture of confusion and fear. At the end of the corridor, the trail of light passed through a door that hadn't existed moments before. Thomas hesitated only briefly before turning the handle and stepping through. He found himself in what appeared to be the house's library, though much larger than its physical counterpart. Bookshelves stretched impossibly high, vanishing into shadows above. Seated at a desk in the center of the room was a man Thomas recognized immediately. Elias? Dr. Elias Mercer looked up from the book he had been studying, his eyes widening in shock. "Thomas? How are you here? Is it November 17th already?" "Yes," Thomas replied, moving quickly to his side. "We don't have much time. We've opened a gateway back to our world, but it will only remain open for," he checked his watch, 15 minutes now. Elias stood shakily, looking both hopeful and suspicious. "This could be another of its tricks. The entity has shown me false rescues before, made me believe I was going home, only to reveal the deception at the last moment." Thomas gripped his shoulders. "This is real. Elias. Feel this." He pressed the Tektite pendant into Elias's hand. The stone glowed briefly at the contact, and Elias gasped. "It's warm," he whispered. "Nothing in this place has warmth. We need to find the others," Thomas urged. "All 7 of you have to go through the gateway together for the ritual to work." Elias's expression darkened. "The others are scattered throughout the house. The entity keeps us separated most of the time. But there's something else you should know, Thomas. There aren't just 7 of us here." "What do you mean?" "I've encountered at least a dozen others during my time here, people taken over the centuries, some so faded they're barely conscious anymore. The entity feeds on them slowly, consuming their essence bit by bit." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the perpetual cold of this realm. Their research had identified only 7 confirmed cases, but he had suspected there might be more. How many souls had the entity trapped over the centuries? "We need to find as many as we can," he decided. The ritual should work for all of them, following the luminescent trails visible through the power of the pendant. Thomas and Elias moved deeper into the impossible house. In a dining room where an eternal feast of inedible food lay rotting on the table, they found Maria Vasquez sitting motionless in a chair, staring at nothing. She responded only when the pendant was pressed into her hand, life returning to her eyes as she joined their growing group. In quick succession, they located 4 more from their list. David Corbin in a bathroom where black water continuously overflowed from all fixtures. Catherine Abbott in a ballroom dancing with a partner who was little more than a shadow. Jonathan Fleming in a basement filled with ticking clocks, all showing different times. And Robert Whitaker in an attic crowded with mirrors that reflected things that weren't there. "That's 6, Thomas said, checking his watch again. "We have 9 minutes left. We still need to find Samuel Green and any others who might be here." The final luminescent trail led them to what should have been the master bedroom, but was instead a massive chamber with a ceiling that opened to a starless void. In the center of the room stood an oversized 4-poster bed, and seated on its edge was an elderly man in clothing from the early 20th century. Samuel Green? Thomas approached carefully. The man looked up, his eyes cloudy and unfocused. "Are you real?" he asked, his voice cracking from apparent disuse. "It sends phantoms sometimes, wearing the faces of people I once knew." Thomas pressed the pendant into his hand, and Samuel gasped as recognition dawned on his face. "You've come from outside," he whispered. "After all this time." "We're all leaving," Thomas assured him. "But we need to hurry. The gateway won't stay open much longer." As Samuel Green joined their group, making 7 in total, Thomas noticed other shapes emerging from the shadows around the room, hazy, indistinct figures that seemed to flicker in and out of visibility. These were the others Elias had mentioned, souls who had been here so long they had begun to lose their substance, consumed by the entity over decades or even centuries. "Can you hear me?" Thomas called to them, holding up the pendant. Its light pulsed stronger, illuminating the ghostly figures. "We're leaving this place. All of you can come with us." The figures drifted closer, drawn to the pendant's light like moths to a flame. As they approached, they became slightly more defined, men and women from different eras, their clothing and appearances spanning centuries. Thomas counted 11 additional souls besides the 7 they had already gathered. 6 minutes, he announced, checking his watch again. "We need to get back to the nursery now," leading the group back through. The twisting corridors proved more difficult than Thomas had anticipated. The house seemed to be actively working against them, hallways extending impossibly, doors disappearing just as they reached them, staircases rearranging their steps as they climbed. Without the pendant's guidance, they would have been hopelessly lost in the ever-changing labyrinth. As they neared the nursery, the whispers that perpetually filled the air grew louder, more insistent, forming words now rather than indistinct sounds. "Stay, belong to us. Never leave, forever here, ignore it," Thomas urged the group. "Keep moving forward. Focus on the light." The pendant's glow had intensified, creating a beacon that cut through the shadows. But as they turned the final corner toward the nursery, Thomas stopped abruptly, causing the others to halt behind him. Standing in the doorway was the tall figure he remembered all too well, the entity itself, its form seeming to absorb the darkness around it, its face still, that featureless void. But now it appeared more solid, more present than Thomas had ever seen it before. "It knows what we're doing," Elias whispered. "It won't let us pass." Thomas clutched the pendant tightly. "Dr. Riverstone said it can't touch this stone. It exists in both worlds simultaneously." He stepped forward, holding the pendant out before him like a shield. "Let us pass," he commanded, his voice stronger than he felt. "You have no power over us anymore." The entity remained motionless, blocking the doorway. Behind it, Thomas could just make out the shimmering oval of the gateway still active in the nursery beyond. 4 minutes remained. "We need another way in," Maria Vasquez said, her voice shaking with fear and hope. "There must be another entrance." Thomas closed his eyes, concentrating on the pendant's energy. In his mind's eye, he could see the layout of the house in both realms simultaneously, the physical structure maintained by Dr. Riverstone's ritual, and this twisted shadow version controlled by the entity, where the two overlapped most strongly. "There," he said, pointing to what appeared to be a solid wall to their right. "The boundary is thin there. We can break through." Samuel Green, the oldest of the group, stepped forward. "I've been here the longest. Let me try." He placed his hand against the wall and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly his hand began to sink into the seemingly solid surface. The wall rippled like water, and a narrow opening began to form. "Everyone through now," Thomas directed. One by one, the rescued souls slipped through the opening, first the 7 they had come for, then the 11 additional spirits, their forms becoming more substantial as they neared the gateway to freedom. Thomas went last, keeping his eyes on the entity still blocking the main doorway. As he prepared to step through the opening in the wall, the figure finally moved. Gliding toward him with that unnatural, jerky motion, the whispers rose to a roar, filling his mind with promises and threats. "Stay with us, replace them, power beyond imagining, or suffer eternally, double." Quotes. Thomas felt a momentary pull, an almost irresistible urge to stay, to accept what the entity offered. Then the pendant pulsed against his chest, breaking the spell. He leapt through the opening just as the entity reached for him, its elongated fingers passing through the space where he had stood an instant before. Inside the nursery, the gateway shimmered vibrantly, its edges beginning to fluctuate as the ritual neared its conclusion. The rescued souls had gathered around it, hesitating at the threshold between worlds. 2 minutes, Thomas announced. "You need to go through now. Elias, lead them." Elias nodded, stepping up to the gateway. "What about you? I'll be right behind you. I need to make sure everyone gets through." One by one, the souls passed through the shimmering portal, Elias first, followed by David, Maria, Jonathan, Catherine, Robert, and Samuel. As each one crossed the boundary, Thomas could see them appear in the physical world on the other side, where Sarah and Dr. Riverstone waited, their expressions a mixture of astonishment and relief. The 11 additional spirits followed, their forms becoming briefly more defined as they passed through the gateway, years of captivity falling away as they returned to the world of the living. On the other side, they appeared as translucent figures, visible for just a moment before they dissolved into motes of light that scattered in all directions, souls finally free to move on after decades or centuries of imprisonment. Thomas checked his watch again. 45 seconds remaining. He moved toward the gateway, ready to make his own escape from this nightmare realm. But as he reached the threshold, the entire house shuddered violently as if struck by an earthquake. The walls cracked, the floor buckled, and the ceiling began to collapse inward. The entity was reacting to the loss of its anchors, its connection to the physical world weakening with each soul that escaped. The shadow realm was beginning to collapse. 30 seconds. Thomas stepped up to the gateway, the physical world tantalizingly visible through the shimmering portal. He could see Sarah reaching out toward him, her mouth forming words he couldn't hear. Then, just as he prepared to step through, a child's cry echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, a sound of such pure fear and desperation that Thomas froze in place. "Eleanor?" he whispered, turning back toward the collapsing corridor. "Thomas, come through now." Sarah's voice finally penetrated the boundary, urgent and frightened. 20 seconds. "There's someone else," he called back. "I can hear a child. It's a trick." Dr. Riverstone's voice this time. "The entity is trying to keep you there?" The cry came again, unmistakably that of a terrified child. Thomas thought of Eleanor Mason, trapped for decades in this nightmare realm until he had unwittingly helped her escape. How many other children might the entity have taken over the centuries? 10 seconds. Thomas made his decision. "Close it after me," he called to Sarah. "I'm coming through, but there's one more I have to find first." Before she could respond, he turned and ran back into the collapsing house, following the sound of the child's cries. The pendant's light guided him through the chaos, leading him down a corridor that hadn't existed before, to a small closet hidden beneath a staircase. Inside, curled into a tight ball, was a young boy no more than 8 years old, dressed in clothing that looked to be from the 1970s. He looked up at Thomas with eyes wide with terror and desperate hope. "Are you real?" the boy whispered. Thomas knelt beside him, the pendant's light illuminating them both. "Yes, I'm real. I'm here to take you home." He scooped the child into his arms and turned back the way he had come, racing against the collapsing structure of the shadow realm and the rapidly dwindling time remaining before the gateway closed forever. 3 seconds. The nursery came into view, the gateway now pulsing erratically, its edges beginning to dissolve as the ritual reached its conclusion. 2 seconds. Thomas sprinted forward, the boy clutched tightly against his chest, the pendant blazing with light as it sensed the boundary between worlds. 1 second. With a final desperate lunge, Thomas dove toward the shrinking portal. The boy held protectively in his arms as the shadow realm disintegrated around them. 0. On the other side. Sarah and Dr. Riverstone maintained the chant that kept the gateway open, stretching the ritual to its absolute limit. The 17 rescued souls watched in tense silence as the portal flickered and began to close. At the last possible moment, a figure emerged, Thomas, tumbling through the gateway with a small boy in his arms, both of them landing hard on the nursery floor as the portal snapped shut behind them with an audible crack like breaking glass. The temperature in the room immediately returned to normal. The candles flickered once, then steadied. The symbols on the walls stopped glowing, becoming once more just ochre marks on faded wallpaper. For a moment no one spoke, the only sound Thomas's ragged breathing as he lay on the floor, still clutching the boy who stared around in bewilderment at his sudden return to the physical world. "You cut it extremely close," Dr. Riverstone finally said, her voice hoarse from the extended chanting. "One more second and the connection would have been permanently severed." Thomas sat up slowly, helping the boy to his feet. "This is Marcus," he said. "He's been there since 1978. There was no way I could leave him behind." Sarah knelt beside them, her face a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "When you went back in, I thought ... I was afraid you weren't coming back this time." "I promised I would," Thomas replied simply. He looked around at the gathered souls, 18 in total, including himself and the boy. "Did it work? Is the entity gone?" "Doctor." Riverstone nodded, her expression solemn. "The ritual is complete. All anchors have been removed. The connection between our world and that realm has been severed permanently. The entity is trapped in its own dimension, with no way to reach ours again." As if to confirm her words, the tektite pendant around Thomas's neck suddenly crumbled to dust, its purpose fulfilled. The released souls began to fade from view one by one, their expressions peaceful as they finally moved on to whatever awaited them beyond this world. Only the 7 most recent victims, those who had physical bodies to return to, remained visible. What will happen to them? Thomas asked, watching as the last of the ancient spirits dissolved into light. They've been freed from their imprisonment, Dr. Riverstone explained. Their souls can now continue their journey, no longer bound to the entity or this place. Young Marcus looked up at Thomas, his eyes wide with wonder. Am I really home? Is it over? Thomas hugged the boy gently. Yes, it's over. You're safe now. As dawn broke over the Mason house, casting golden light through the windows of the nursery, Sarah stood with Thomas on the porch, watching as Dr. Riverstone helped the freed victims into her van. They would all need time to adjust to their return, especially those like Samuel Green, who had been gone for over a century, but they were alive, free, and finally safe from the entity's grasp. What happens now? Sarah asked quietly. Thomas looked out at the woods where he had first found Eleanor's diary fragment just 1 year ago. Now we make sure this never happens again. We document everything, preserve the knowledge of what happened here and how to fight it. Just in case. In case of what? You heard Dr. Riverstone, the entity is trapped permanently. Thomas smiled faintly. I've learned not to use words like permanently when dealing with things that have existed for centuries. But even if this particular entity never returns, there may be others. The world is older and stranger than most people realize. Sarah nodded, understanding his caution. So we become the keepers of the story. Exactly. We tell it to those who need to hear it, preserve the knowledge for those who might face something similar. After all, Thomas added, looking back at the now ordinary house behind them, every good ghost story contains a warning, if you know how to listen for it. As they walked away from the Mason house for the final time, neither of them noticed the small handprint that briefly appeared in the condensation on one of the nursery windows, a print too small to belong to any of the freed victims. It lingered for just a moment before fading away, leaving no trace of its existence except perhaps a whisper that no one was there to hear. 1 year later, November 17th, 2026, Sarah Collins stood before the assembled students in the University of Virginia's Paranormal Studies seminar, a course that had been little more than a novelty elective before the events at the Mason House changed everything. Now it was one of the most popular classes on campus, with a waiting list 3 semesters long. What we experienced that night defies conventional explanation, she was saying, clicking through slides that showed the ritual preparations, the stone circle in the woods, and the symbols drawn on the nursery walls. But the evidence is irrefutable. 18 souls were rescued from an interdimensional entity that had been trapping and consuming people for at least 2 centuries. In the back row, Thomas Hargrove watched with a small smile as the students leaned forward in their seats, completely captivated. His role as guest lecturer had expanded into a permanent position at the university's newly formed Department of Paranormal and Interdimensional Studies, where he worked alongside Dr. Riverstone to document and analyze supernatural phenomena. The entity itself, Sarah continued, appears to have originated from what the Monacan people called the space between spaces, a dimension that occasionally overlaps with our own at certain weak points. The Mason property was one such point, strengthened over centuries by the entity's accumulated power. A student raised her hand. But if the entity is gone and the connection is severed, why do people still report strange experiences in those woods? Sarah glanced at Thomas before answering. This was the question they had been debating themselves for months. Think of it like an echo, she suggested. When something exists in a place for centuries, it leaves an imprint. What people experience now is just the residual energy, not the entity itself. At least, that was what they hoped. After the class, Thomas and Sarah walked across the autumn campus, fallen leaves crunching beneath their feet. The events of the previous year had forged a bond between them that transcended ordinary friendship. They had glimpsed realities that few others could comprehend and emerged with their sanity intact, if forever changed. Marcus called yesterday, Thomas mentioned as they passed the university chapel. He's adjusting well to his new foster family, still having nightmares, but Dr. Kazan says that's to be expected given what he endured. Sarah nodded. And the others? Mixed results. Elias has thrown himself into research trying to understand what happened to him scientifically. David and Maria have formed a support group for the others. Samuel ... all quotes. Thomas shook his head sadly. Samuel is still struggling. The world changed too much during his absence. He spends most of his time in the Historical Society, surrounded by objects from his era. They reached the small coffee shop just off campus where they often met to discuss their ongoing research. As they settled at their usual corner table, Thomas pulled out a leather-bound journal nearly identical to Eleanor Mason's diary. I've been compiling everything we know about the entity and the ritual, he explained, opening the journal to reveal pages of meticulous notes, diagrams, and observations. Dr. Riverstone helped me cross-reference it with Monacan oral traditions and other historical accounts of similar phenomena worldwide. Sarah examined a page containing a map marked with dozens of dots spread across the United States. What are these? Possible weak points, locations where the boundary between dimensions might be thin. Places with unusually high rates of unexplained disappearances or consistent reports of phenomena similar to what we experienced. You think there are more entities like the one we encountered? Thomas closed the journal. I think our understanding of reality is fundamentally incomplete. The entity may have been unique, or it may have been one of many. Either way, we're better prepared now than we were before. Their coffee arrived, and the conversation shifted to more mundane topics: the upcoming departmental review, plans for Thanksgiving, a conference in Boston where they would be presenting their findings to a select group of academic colleagues who specialized in unexplained phenomena. As they were preparing to leave, Thomas's phone buzzed with a news alert. He checked it, his expression growing serious as he read. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "A child has gone missing in rural Maine," he replied, showing her the article. 10-year-old boy disappeared while playing near the woods behind his house 3 days ago. Extensive search has found no trace. That could be anything, Sarah pointed out. Children go missing for many reasons, most of them tragically ordinary. Yes, but look at the location. Thomas pointed to the town name, Stillwater, Maine. It's one of the weak points on my map. And there's more. He scrolled down to reveal additional details. The boy's parents report that for weeks before his disappearance, he complained about whispers in his room at night, and a tall figure watching him from the edge of the woods. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. It could be a coincidence. Or maybe the boy heard stories similar to ours online and incorporated them into his imagination. Maybe, Thomas agreed, though he didn't sound convinced. But there's one more thing. He scrolled to the final paragraph of the article. Local. Historical Society records indicate this is not the first such disappearance in Stillwater. Almost exactly 127 years ago, in November 1899, another child vanished under similar circumstances from the same area. They stared at each other across the table, both thinking the same thing but hesitant to voice it aloud. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "We should at least look into it," she said. "If it's nothing, we've lost nothing but time." Thomas nodded, already pulling up travel options on his phone. "I can get us flights to Bangor tomorrow morning. From there, it's about an hour's drive to Stillwater." As they left the coffee shop, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the campus. Thomas paused, looking back toward the distant ridge where the Mason house stood empty once more, its windows dark and shuttered. "Do you ever wonder," he asked quietly, "if we truly understood what we were dealing with? Or if we just saw the small part of it that intersected with our reality?" Sarah followed his gaze. "What do you mean?" "Something Dr. Riverstone said has been bothering me." When she translated the Monacan texts about the entity, there was a phrase she couldn't quite interpret, something about the many-faced one or the one with many aspects. What if what we encountered, what we trapped, ... What if it was just one manifestation of something much larger? The implication hung in the air between them, disturbing in its enormity. If true, it would mean their victory had been incomplete, not the end of something ancient and evil, but merely the closing of one door among many. "Then we keep looking," Sarah said firmly. "We keep learning. And when we find another door, we close that one too." Thomas smiled, grateful for her unwavering resolve. "To Stillwater, then. To Stillwater," she agreed. "But this time we go in prepared." As they walked toward the parking lot, neither noticed the small figure watching them from the shadow of an ancient oak tree, a girl in a white pinafore dress. Her expression solemn as she followed their progress across the campus. She remained perfectly still until they were out of sight, then slowly faded from view, leaving behind only a whisper that was quickly lost in the rustle of fallen leaves. "It's beginning again. Until November 17, 2027.